What is up, everyone? It's Quinn here, and in today's video, I'm going to be going through the best wide receiver draft strategy in 2024 here for fantasy football. So, we're going to be talking about some of the general trends at the wide receiver position, some of the top targets that you guys should be looking for. I'm going to be running through some different mock drafts to show you how you can kind of approach the position from different points, late, mid, and early first round, and then also just talk about the general types of players you should be targeting, maybe looking at some rookies, also what types of flyers you should be throwing out in the later rounds for some wide receiver sleepers. So that's what I'm going to be focusing in on today. If you guys enjoy the video, do me a huge favor, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. But let's just jump right into it, and I want to start off by saying that my strategy is definitely going to change depending on what type of league I'm in and what kind of platform I'm actually playing on. So I think we've seen, at least so far in the offseason, and we've seen this, in previous years, there's going to be a big difference on where wide receivers go off the board in more competitive leagues versus on more casual platforms where maybe the running backs will get pushed up, wide receivers will end up being values. And just to kind of show you guys what I'm talking about, looking at ESPN's current ADP compared to Underdog Fantasy Football, Underdog all paid drafts, so the ADP is fairly sharp, and it will be a little bit skewed towards wide receivers because it's start 2 running backs, 3 wide receivers, I think 1 flex, so it will be skewed a little bit in favor of wide receivers, but it's pretty extreme. But one thing you notice here is that there's not a huge difference in like the early rounds, the first 8 wide receivers. You can see here on ESPN, the wide receivers, throughout the first round, you have Puka, Garrett Wilson, like the very start of round 2. You look at Underdog, obviously all these wide receivers are going in round 1, but the ADP doesn't have a massive difference, which at least tells me that on some of these more casual platforms, maybe you look to go running back early on if it makes sense, because then you're going to have a difference in wide receiver value later on. You can see on this next slide that from wide receiver 9 through 20, there is a massive difference in where these guys are being drafted. On the Underdog side, wide receiver 20 is going off the board as an early round 3 pick compared to on ESPN, which is like a 4-5 turn pick. So maybe you go running back early on, you're going to have a ton of wide receiver value falling to you if you are drafting on a platform like ESPN, Yahoo, even Sleeper to some extent, because you can just see the massive difference, right? Outside of those like first round wide receivers, this next tier of guys are going like late second or later on. So on ESPN, you may get stuck where if you take, wide receiver early on, then you're having to reach at running back as opposed to kind of snagging the value here in like the 3rd, 4th, 5th round. Here in 2024, I feel like the wide receiver position is in a very unique place, specifically once we're getting into like the 2nd, 3rd round options. These are my personal rankings, so this is how I'm breaking up the wide receivers into tiers, but I think for most people, these tiers through the first 3 are pretty consensus. You have CeeDee Lamb, Tyreek Hill up there in tier 1. Some people, may disagree on Jamar Chase being up there. Maybe they'd have him in tier 2, but I think for most people, CeeDee Lamb and Tyreek Hill are the top 2 options. Then you've got Jamar Chase, maybe Amon-Ra St. Brown, Justin Jefferson, but I think Amon-Ra St. Brown and Jefferson are kind of sandwiched between tier 1 and tier 3. And then for tier 3, maybe people don't agree with the order of Puka, Garrett Wilson, A.J. Brown, but I think most people out there do have those 3 wide receivers as like their wide receiver 6, 7, and 8. It all kind of falls apart once we get into like tier 4, tier 5, tier 6, tier 7. There definitely seems to be a pretty significant drop-off from wide receiver 8 to wide receiver 9. So this is how I'm ranking these wide receivers, but these definitely, aren't super in line with consensus. I don't even really think there is a consensus. From platform to platform, there are going to be a lot of differences, which I think also, makes the idea of snagging wide receivers in the 3rd, 4th, 5th round a really solid option, because you may value a player as like a late 2nd round option, but on a specific platform, they could end up like being picked in like round 4, maybe even later round 5. Like I'd view Tank Dell as like a round 3 option. He's someone who's going like in the 5th round on certain platforms. And you can see here, historically, it's also really paid off to be targeting the wide receiver position in rounds 4 and 5. So this is using RotoViz's win rate. It's not perfect because it's focused on best ball, but I do think it's a solid tool here. So, every person in theory has like a 1 in 12 chance of winning their league, assuming there's 12 teams in the league, which is like 8.3% repeating chance. So I found from 2017 through 2023, these are the win rates of drafting wide receivers in the different rounds. So you can see round 1, not great, 35% above that 8.3 number. The 2 rounds I want to focus on here are round 4 and round 5. You can see you have a 50% chance at getting a plus win rate wide receiver in round 4, and then 60.5% of getting that in round 5. And not only has it paid off to draft wide receiver there, but it has also hurt in previous seasons to go after running backs in that range. I'm sure you guys have heard of the running back dead zone. If you haven't, it's pretty much like rounds 4, 5, 6, 7. Maybe in previous years it was like 3 through 6, or it can encompass a decent range of those middle rounds, but generally it's a spot where running backs don't pan out. Certain players get pushed up draft boards because people are desperate at the running back position. They're kind of projecting volume on running backs that maybe don't have it locked in, not the most talented guys, and so typically that's been a spot where you want to pivot away from the running back position. And you can see here, this is the same chart just for running backs, and only 31% of running backs picked in round 4 from 2017 to 2023 had a win rate above 8.33%, and then in round 5 only 34.6%. So you typically want to be passing on running backs in that range and hammering those wide receivers. Now obviously this isn't just like a set it and forget it rule. If you have a wide receiver falling to a spot where you like it, I'm not saying you have to pick a wide receiver, but in general that's probably a spot where you should be looking at the wide receiver position. And then I just wanted to kind of take a look at some of those wide receivers going in that range. So this is 4 for 4 ADP, probably like the best consensus ADP out there, just takes a ton of different platforms. And these are the wide receivers that are currently getting picked from round 4 through round 5. And I think most of these guys are pretty solid options. I may disagree on how these wide receivers are like ranked compared to other wide receivers, but in terms of how these guys are valued compared to other positions, I think most of these guys are really nice values. Like, I don't really love Stephon Diggs as wide receiver 23, but if you're taking him at pick 43, I really don't think that's a terrible spot. Some guys that stand out as players I really like, DJ Moore here. If you're getting DJ Moore round 4, that's amazing. I like Malik Neighbors in round 5. Tank Dell, especially in round 5, I like it. But I'd pretty much be interested in all these wide receivers is the point. It's just a nice kind of section of the draft where wide receiver position ends up having a lot of value for you. Now in the next slide, I just wanted to point out some specific wide receivers who I think are really solid values this season. The first one is going to be Drake London, and in that range where like the back end wide receiver ones are kind of all over the place, Drake London's the guy I like as the wide receiver 10, right behind Marvin Harrison Jr. There's not a huge difference. He's going off the board as like the wide receiver 12, but his ADP's at 20. I'd be much more willing to take him, at least a few picks earlier than that. DJ Moore, someone I mentioned, I have him ranked as my wide receiver 16. He's going off the board as the wide receiver 20. Really like Malik Neighbors. I think people are burying him because of the landing spot, but he is an insanely talented player, being drafted as the wide receiver 25. I have him as my wide receiver 19. Tank Dell is the guy that I probably have the biggest difference with in terms of being just overly high on him. He's like my wide receiver 18 in that range, but he's going off the board as like a high-end wide receiver 3 as the wide receiver 27. And then one other guy, Marquise Brown, someone who maybe I won't be quite as high on if Rashee Rice doesn't get suspended, but I have him as the wide receiver 31. He's going off the board as the wide receiver 36, around pick 76, which I think is pretty extreme. What's that, like a 7th round pick? Way too late for the potential wide receiver 1 on this Chiefs offense. Now we're going to be looking at what types of players have panned out as later round options, and then just what type of like archetypes we should be looking to target here. So I believe these are all wide receivers picked outside the first 10 rounds in fantasy drafts, and these are all guys who have given you a 14% or better win rate. So just by hitting on one of these guys in the later rounds, they definitely upped your win percent by a decent amount here. If your average team has 8.3%, just getting these picks gave you 14% or better chance to win your league. On this chart, you can see the player, the year they had that season, their ADP, their point per game rank, and then what year they were in the NFL, and then how they ranked in terms of targets on their offense. So something that's, I guess, not super shocking is that most of these guys were leading their offenses in targets. So that's obviously something we should be looking for. Situations where maybe these later round wide receivers have at least a chance to be the number 1 weapon on their team. Now, injuries were definitely a factor for some of these options, but other guys just came in. They were impressive enough to lead their team in targets. You can also see here we have a decent amount of younger options. what's this? 5 of these guys were rookies, 2 of them were second-year options, 1 a third-year guy, and then some dudes in their 4th and 5th year. But I do think it makes sense to go after some of these younger options. You just kind of have the uncertainty of a rookie coming in, a second-year guy where maybe they haven't had the opportunity to prove themselves yet. But if you're like in these later rounds and you're throwing these darts at veterans who just year after year have not proven themselves to be solid NFL players or have not proven themselves to be solid fantasy options, those aren't picks I love. You can see here it did work out in some spots. Devonta Parker, Mike Williams, Hunter Renfrow. Brashad Perriman's a weird one. Since it is best ball, he's kind of skewed because he had just an insane finish to the season. So that's why it was like pretty much fantasy playoffs. He was dominating, only averaged 9.9 points per game on the season. But he's another one of these guys who qualifies as a later round option. So keeping that in mind, typically looking to target some of these younger options, guys who have an opportunity to lead their team in targets. These are some of the later round options that I am personally looking at, some guys I'm interested in targeting, and we're actually going to start it off here with a veteran. So even though I don't love going after, those late round veteran wide receivers, I think Curtis Samuel is a solid example here. Being drafted as the wide receiver 53, he's someone who's proven to have like fringe wide receiver 2 fantasy upside, and he did that on a much worse offense. I think he's still like 27, 28 years old, not like he's at risk of just like completely falling off. And now he's definitely in the best offensive situation of his career with Josh Allen at quarterback. You have some uncertainty with Keon Coleman, Khalil Shakir, Dalton Kincaid. Like, are we sure those guys are going to be, monsters in this offense? Like, who knows? Maybe they have, slow seasons. Curtis Samuel ends up just being the wide receiver 1 on this Josh Allen-led offense. It wouldn't shock me if he ended up leading this team in targets, which definitely could help his fantasy upside. One guy who maybe isn't lined up to lead his team in targets would be Dontavian Wicks. But Dontavian Wicks last year as a rookie, he was super efficient in the work that he actually got. And I think you're looking at this wide receiver room, and people maybe, really like Jayden Reed. They think he's the locked-in leader. I personally really like Christian Watson as someone going a little bit later on than Jayden Reed, but I just think there's enough uncertainty where, Christian Watson's had some injury issues. Dontavian Wicks may have the opportunity to slide into a starting wide receiver role, and then who knows how that plays out. Maybe he ends up leading this team in targets. Maybe he pays off where they're like running a ton of 3 wide receiver sets, and you just have 3 wide receivers that are pretty heavily targeted. I just think at wide receiver 64, he flashed enough as a rookie to get me at least a little bit interested. Then we have Xavier Legette, wide receiver 66. I wasn't a huge fan of Legette as a prospect, but I do think this Panthers offense isn't going to be as miserable as they were last year. I would definitely expect Deontay to lead this wide receiver room, but I don't think Legette as like a wide receiver 2 could be completely useless. He's not going to be getting the defense's best coverage. That's going to go to Deontay Johnson, so he'll probably have a role to be a day 1 starter, someone who's at least interesting as a rookie. Then 2 Patriots wide receivers. This Patriots wide receiver room is completely wide open. So a guy like Demario Douglas, who kind of flashed a little bit last year, heading into year 2, still young, slot dude who can command a lot of volume. He's interesting to me. And then Jalen Polk, early round 2 pick, someone who should have an inside shot to be a starting wide receiver this year. So those are some of the later round options I'm looking at. And I also mentioned earlier on, talking about those later round options, rookies, younger options can definitely pay off big time for fantasy, especially on more casual platforms where, not every player in your league is super familiar with these guys. They're not locked in on the draft. They don't know the upside that rookie wide receivers can have. These are some of the rookies that I'm focused on targeting this season. Already talked about Malik Nabers up top. I'm cool with Marvin Harrison Jr.'s current price, but these are guys being drafted as wide receiver 4s. I guess they're all being drafted as wide receiver 4s, but I'd be interested in all of these dudes at their current price. Rome Odunze, wide receiver 41. I know he has a lot of target competition, but I don't think it would be shocking for Rome Odunze to be the wide receiver 2 and 2 wide receiver sets. Keenan Allen, getting up there in age, has had some injury concerns. I think Caleb Williams is going to produce from day 1. Also, an injury could definitely just open things up for him. Ladd McConkey pretty much seems set to be the wide receiver 1 on this team, playing out of the slot, could definitely command a lot of volume. Xavier Worthy at wide receiver 44 to me is insane. Even if Rashee Rice doesn't get suspended, he should not be going this late. I mean, he has legit wide receiver 1 upside on this Chiefs offense. This Chiefs offense was rough last year, at least, compared to what they had been in previous seasons. They didn't have enough firepower at the wide receiver position. Xavier Worthy absolutely gives them that. Keon Coleman, potential wide receiver 1 for Josh Allen, and then Brian Thomas Jr., someone who I think skill set fits really well with Trevor Lawrence. Calvin Ridley's gone. I think Brian Thomas Jr. can step in and definitely make an impact here from week 1. Now we're going to be looking at some mock drafts. These are spots where I just, kind of went in different directions at the wide receiver position. Some of these really hammered them early on. Others may be weighted at wide receiver. So starting off here with this first one, you can see the league settings. It's going to be the same for all of these. 1 quarterback, 2 running backs, 2 wide receivers, a tight end, and then 2 flex spots. So this draft is from the 101, and this was a double hero RB team. So we went Christian McCaffrey 101, Devon Achane 212. CMC is going to be my 101, pretty much every single time. Devon Achane, if I'm getting him 2-3 turn, I love that price tag. But at this point, after going 2 running backs, wanted to hammer the wide receiver position. I went Brandon Ayuk in the 3rd. This was before his potential holdout trade request, so maybe I wouldn't take him quite that early. I'd probably go like Jalen Waddle instead, but still fine with this pick. And then 4-5 turn, 2 guys who I really like at their current price. Malik Neighbors, Tank Dell. Had those 3 wide receivers, found value at the quarterback position, then around 7, David Montgomery. But then I just talked about those rookies, and you can see who I snagged in round 8, round 9, Brian Thomas Jr. and Keon Coleman, and then another later round option that I gave a shout out to, Curtis Samuel. So even though I didn't spend a top 2 round pick on a wide receiver, I still think this unit ended up being pretty solid with Ayuk, Neighbors, Tank Dell, Brian Thomas Jr., Keon Coleman, Curtis Samuel. Maybe people think this unit's a little bit young, 3 rookies here, a second-year guy, but I'm pretty confident in all of those players, or at least a few of them, breaking out and being fantasy relevant. Now this next draft is going to be from the 6th spot, and this was more of a hero RB team. I went Bijan Robinson at the 106. Didn't necessarily love what I had at the running back position, so then I went wide receiver in round 2, Chris Olave, went Deebo Samuel in round 3, and then I went Devonta Smith in round 4. So 3 really solid wide receivers to start off this draft. I went round 5 tight end, round 6 running back, went back to the wide receiver position with Chris Godwin, another guy who I think is kind of a value this season. I went round 9, DeAndre Hopkins, and then that wrapped up my wide receiver position. So 5 guys, but I felt really confident in all of those picks. Chris Olave, Deebo Samuel, Devonta Smith, Chris Godwin, and then DeAndre Hopkins. And then I believe this is the final mock draft here. We had 1 double hero RB, 1 hero RB. Here is the 0 RB draft. I know some people don't love this. I will say I don't love this on super casual platforms, ESPN, Yahoo, especially if you don't have a ton of flex spots. Like if it's the typical 2 running back, 2 wide receiver, 1 flex, I would strongly advise against doing hero RB, even if it kind of falls into your lap, because you just don't have enough flex spots to take advantage of those wide receivers. But in a spot where we have 2 flex options, I went with it here. And it kind of just is where the value was. Puka, Garrett Wilson, 1-2 turn. Debo, DJ Moore, 3-4 turn. Love the value on all 4 of those wide receivers. Mark Andrews, round 5. And then our final wide receiver was picked here with Amari Cooper. You can see then we hammered the running back position. Brooks, Moss, Robinson, Gus Edwards. And then we went late round quarterback. But I mean, if you can set up like a 0 RB team with this wide receiver start, that's something I'm super interested in if you do have the flex spots to actually play those players. Because if I went 5 of these stud wide receivers, we're looking at, 2 of them starting the season on the bench. It's just not worth it, in that type of setup. But if you do have some flex options, I think a 0 RB could definitely be a viable draft strategy if it kind of falls into your lap. But that's going to wrap it up for this video. Hopefully you guys saw some targets that you can look to acquire on your fantasy teams, how you can kind of start your drafts, where you should be looking to target those wide receivers, and then what types of wide receivers you should be looking to target. So thank you all for stopping by. I've already put out my quarterback and tight end strategy videos. If you haven't seen those, go check them out, and then I'll have my running backs out in a few days. But thank you all for stopping by, and I will see you in the next one.